Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the ISCM webinar on decoding demand planning and forecasting in the post-COVID-19 world. The Institute of Supply Chain Management is a thought leadership institute focusing on education, training, research, consulting, and events. As a good news to all of you, we have today launched our portal called SCM Pro Knowledge. So if you go to scmpro-knowledge.co.in, you will be able to read and browse through all the articles in the SCM Pro site, where you will find interface, opinions, interviews, white papers, etc. So I request you to please log on to SCM Pro Knowledge and use the available material there. Coming to the topic of the day, decoding demand planning and forecasting. Before we go there, and before I invite Dr. Rakesh Singh, who is the Dean of the Institute of Supply, Dean of the Demand Planning Academy and the Chairman of the Institute of Supply Chain and Management, I would like to familiarize you with some of the ground rules that are there for this particular broadcast. One, we will quickly go into the main topic of the day, where Dr. Rakesh Singh will talk to you on decoding demand planning in the post-COVID-19 world. And what you would need to do is to keep your questions coming. If you look at it, you have an option of writing in your questions. So the moment you have a question, you can please type that question in and send it to us. At the end of the session, once Dr. Singh finishes his presentation, we will take up these questions one by one and we will answer them as much as we can given the paucity of time. We have around an hour with us, and therefore without wasting too much of time, I would like to invite Dr. Rakesh Singh, Chairman, Institute of Supply Chain Management and Dean, Demand Planning Academy, to start today's webinar on decoding demand planning and forecasting in the post-COVID-19 world. Dr. Rakesh Singh, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first webinar on decoding demand planning forecasting in the post-COVID-19 world. ISCM has taken this initiative to look at some strategic issues and not those issues which are essentially talked out during normal times. I think if you look at the economics of COVID-19 and you also look at the overall geography of COVID-19, it has been one of the most devastating pandemics that has taken place in the modern days, and which started with China disrupting the supplies and have gone far beyond countries. 186 countries are today under the influence of this pandemic with severe impacts, and the scale and magnitude of impacts also differ from country to country. Some of them are peaking, it seems, but then there are some who are just beginning to get worse. India is in a very different situation. All of us say that we are into stage 2, moving towards stage 3. I think India has undertested. People say that is one kind of assumption that we make, and hence the number of real cases may not be very high. But all said and done, planning and supply chain has been disrupted. In fact, supply chain is the lifeline of any organization, is the lifeline of any nation. And I think it consists of 3 basic elements: man, material, as well as the money. And all the 3 has been disrupted. In fact, you see the human flow of migrant labor on the borders of Delhi and UP and almost everywhere. And even you saw some kind of critical gathering of human laborers in Bandra and Bombay. All these depicts a kind of anxiety-based pandemic which has an enormous cost on the economy. And why it is different from some other disruption, primarily because though the likelihood of occurrences of hurricanes and others are very high, their outcomes also are very predictable, and governments across the globe have been able to predict that, manage that, have a history of managing and resurrecting economies and societies and coming back to it. This pandemic, in fact, has shown a very different pattern, not only impacting the health of people, leading to shutdown of factories, leading to shutdown of logistics networks, logistics players, uh, you know, uh, goods and services not reaching their places. The shipments are down. In fact, in India, till the last week, 37 pin codes were closed for delivery by the logistics player itself, and that number is growing. We have seen the characteristics of the pandemic itself emerging in a very different way, is unfolding different colors of it: yellow, red, blue, green. I don't know how many colors it will happen over a period of time as we move ahead, as we see some of the characteristics of these pandemic. In this situation, if you see, there are a lot of prescriptions that are being given by people about how do you manage the supply chain? How do you see the supply chain uh, reacts to the current challenges of uncertainties in such a way that it minimizes the impact of uncertainty and brings some order into the chaos? If you really look at this particular pandemic and you start analyzing the pandemic in terms of supply chains, and we see the immediate reactions of the supply chain or these pandemics, then you realize that suddenly, all of a sudden, we ignored what was happening in China too. China was undergoing a tremendous, pressure of pandemic. Leave apart the conspiracy theory. In fact, China supplies to the 70% of the world, and hence the supplies were getting affected. Not only that, that was creating a long-term supply disruptions in terms of the procurement risk, where the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 procurement players who forms a fundamental part of your bill of material were affected very badly and still very affected. Nobody knows the impact of it, and predicting the impact of it was an important element, because if someone would have predicted this in a better way, would have been able to create a better resilient policy for their own businesses in the long run. I think one particular hygiene and sanitation company called Diversity, we had another webinar from where I gathered this, that what they saw in early particular signals of China being affected and demand for sanitation and hygiene, given the social distancing norms, is going to increase. They started looking at the alternatives of sourcing materials, and they really set up a lot of contracts from alternative, and they were able to match up the demand. Though the demand they thought would increase by 10x, it actually increased by 80 to 100x, and fulfilling demand was distant free. But this kind of a slight shift helped them to manage a lot of those demands into clusters and cities where it really mattered, and they're doing the same in India. A lot of people have been saying, and if you look at in India, basically, how have you actually responded to the changing dynamics of the pandemic? How has it really affected the whole thing? And I think one basic reaction comes from the supply chain community and primarily demand planning, is that in a webinar that we had a week back, we had a very common perception that planning is not helpful, planning is dead. I think let's do away with SNOP and IBP. Let's plan as much as possible for the short run. It should be hyper local, meaning only for the local economy, and so on and so forth. I think there was a very, very strong thread of idea and consensus that emerged in that particular webinar of around 12 major supply chain heads that it is the demand-driven MRP which is going to be of a great use in such a time. I think this was just a reaction, and the post-pandemic is always a reaction. It's a response that everybody becomes very cautious. There's a lot of anxiety. You respond to the market. You create a system and processes which are very, very focused toward managing short-term impact of pandemics. And if that was the case, let me look at what people actually did. One company chief supply chain officer told us that they started looking, and rightly so, I'm not being critical of this approach. They said, hell with the long-term planning, hell with what happens a week after. Let's see what happens today and what happens tomorrow. Because if you remember the post-lockdown on 25th, today is 1 month is over, and you found that suddenly there were no trucks available, there were no drivers available, there were no workers in the factory, and there was no mechanism to reach the customer. The government announced that essentials will be protected and there wouldn't be a shortage of the essentials. And they started realizing that, as we went further, things were getting very difficult. And as things were getting very difficult, they had to really see what they could do. The food, the pharma companies, the sanitizing companies, and other essential equipment companies started looking at how do we fulfill the emerging demand or demand that is there. But before I go into this, let me tell you that though there was a lot of shock for major companies which were not into essentials, there were non-essentials, these essential companies had a very, very strong spike or surge in the demand, but they couldn't fulfill the demand. When you analyze their overall supply chain, the part supply chain, and when you look at this, you find that Indian companies had a very different set of running supply chains. And they were lucky to find that there was a lot of inventory lying in various levels of their supply chain and echelons or whatever distribution channel. And the first 2, 3, 4 days was a problem because they could not ship this material to the last mile because there were no trucks, there were no drivers, people were leaving, there was chaos all around. Sometimes, your supply chain which gets exposed of excessive material also is helpful under pandemic. And they could service the local demand because of these availability of goods, though where the factory movement as well as logistics were not there. But government became very agile, did a good job of it. In a country where government does not manage its business well, they came out with e-passes and through the e-way bills and others, which really helped them to, help logistics and manpower starts working. And this iterative process of looking at the problems with getting drivers on the board and the manpower in the factory, all these took a lot of time. But I think in these industries things became very clear that yes, there were a lot of workers who had gone home, and suddenly they realized that when they had passes for the transport, they didn't have the driver for the transport, and hence you see the essentials and you see goods not in the shelf. You see supermarkets close, all those closed. Most of these delivery companies, the e-commerce company, could not fulfill their delivery. And one common problem was obviously manpower, and which is not a very usual problem, but that's a problem that emerged because of the pandemic. Jahan bhi, and I think Jahan was more important than Jahan in the process, and people also moved away because the Jahan was not there, so they had to protect their life. These companies, as they emerge out of this, as trucks started being available, they did something very interesting, and they started serving the local areas called hyper local. And wherever they identified wherever there was inventory and how close was that inventory to the local market, and how open was that market and how accessible was that market. And I think that is what happened. And that is how the whole business got planned in a manner of highly local, called hyper local. And even when the delivery was there, there's a lot of talk about these FMCG companies or grocery companies or pharmaceutical collaborating with last mile service providers who fulfill their demand and reach each and every destination. Maybe that becomes a new model for fulfillment. But demand became very, very localized. People started looking at localized demand, and that really led to a very strong belief that planning is dead. And a lot of questions that really got raised in the process. Though people planned for the short run, people planned for the areas which were quarantine, isolated, areas which became red, yellow, and green zones. I think there was a learning also among the spirit. But what was the belief that how does a company build this capability? And how is it difficult or different from the past when you are serving a catchment area? Because this also is a catchment area, yellow, red, green, orange, or nearby places which can be serviced for groceries and other essentials. You need an inventory, you need it to be produced, and you need it to be, sourced. Material has to be sourced to produce this. How was this happening? Probably one of the fundamental first level, as I said earlier, was that a lot of inventory lying in the supply chain, as Indian supply chains vulnerabilities were almost shown, but then it really helped them to meet the demand at one of the most difficult and uncertain period of time. And then it raised a lot of questions. If you look at planners and we're talking to planners, we believe that we need to really be very short-termist in this period. This is a new paradigm. This is a new normal. This is the next normal. I think big question is that, is this the new normal? Is this the new paradigm? People said long-term planning would be dead. I think nobody will talk about long-term planning. My big question is that, will the long-term planning be dead? And hence there are a lot of assumption made that IBP may not be very helpful. And we had a senior speaker who had worked in the areas of the MRP saying that SNOP is not really helpful and so on. So is SNOP and long-term planning then is definitely not required in the current phase? Now that is one thing that really, should we cancel advanced planning and IBP meetings during the period of time? Are the processes not important during the period of pandemics? And how do we manage the complexity of supply chain during pandemics? And hence, a lot of people said that when you start looking at local markets, when you start looking at replenishment, then there is no question of forecasting. How? Because you can have your decoupling points with some stock under the DDMRP, and that is going to help you to service almost all the last destinations of demand, last miles of demand. Now, one question which comes up in my mind, and I thought that I should bring this about here, is that as we move along this particular thought process, what could be the danger that while we looked at hyper-local approaches in the short run as a reactionary policies in the first phase of lockdown and even going on during the second phase of lockdown, are we getting too much fooled by the whole concept of DDMRP? I know this may not be liked by a lot of people who have a very strong orientation towards DDMRP and so, but people say forecasting is dead because replenishment is the norm of the day, and I can understand whatever be the demand in the market, I can replenish. That should be my capability. I think I was reading a very interesting book by the Resilient Enterprises by Yossi Sefi. And when I read this book by Yossi Sefi, I believe that it is a very, very, very strong eye-opener. It says that few events whose likelihoods are low has a huge impact on the businesses, both in terms of length and magnitude, and hence becomes very disruptive and creates a lot of disruptions. One of the things he says is that what we don't realize in the demand chain and the demand-driven supply chain methods of replenishment is that your bill of material, which consists of several materials, which consists of several materials, which consists of several materials, there's a layer of it. During such pandemic, go through a bullwhip effect, and one does not know what happens to the supply even for a long period of time. My basic contention is that maybe our inventory help in the short run. Are we taking into account the supplies that goes into the bill of material and then goes into helping your production plan? Because your production plans according to DDMRP has to change, and that change will lead to decoupling point or inventory point, which will automatically change, and hence the demand will be fulfilled. I think one of the biggest disruptions of likelihood and impact approach that you saw was this, and second was on manpower and money and material. You see, manpower, everybody has migrated to the villages. There is a quarantine within the villages. There's not many people who will return, even if things may come back fast. There will be a long-term recovery of labor. There will be a long-term recovery of public transport running through, because the fear that exists post normalization or return, a semi-return, is going to really create a different behaviors that need to be encompassed into your planning processes. And I think this is where the difference lies, that this particular pandemic is so very different, and we have not been able to detect this. How long will this go? Is it easy to say green, orange, and this thing and keep on running your funnel? I think that's another danger in the DDMRP approach. It's very binary in thinking. It is very simplistic in thinking, because it says that whatever you put in your MRP numbers, your whole supply chain will become completely transparent and will adjust. If only numbers and supply chain would adjust, then there would be no need for any human interventions, and things would have been much easier on human thinking or processes or planning or IBP or SNOP. So one thing I would like to say in the whole process of having a very strong belief in this short-term approach and letting DDMRP then drive is that there are constraints which DDMRP in its binary thinking does not take into account. One is the constraint of capacity. Two, the constraint of excessive demand in the period. And three, huge amount of surge in the demand which cannot be fulfilled by any production system given their capacities, or any disruption by sanitizers and groceries and other things, vegetables and all other essential elements, PPEs, and you cannot fulfill it. And hence there is a need for innovation, speed, planning, and that needs to be taken into account. So DDMRP, if you go by the logic, is a very good idea of lean and MRP based in a very stable time. There's a very good article in Harvard Business Review, and all of us should review this. It says that what is the right supply chain for your product, and it classifies the product into two basic characteristics. One is functional and another is dynamic. Most FMCGs who use the MRP are functional product. They have everything there to see, and hence they survive with a huge amount of inventory. In fact, I asked one of the senior person from FMCG, a proponent of DDMRP and theory of constraint, that how do you focus beyond your districts? How do you understand blocks and villages in India? How do you run your MRP there? There are so many levels of supply chain, and hence there would be so many inventory lying into these villages that the tires and super stockists at the district level is not going to be able to capture the demand in the retail sanities. How do you do this? So I think there are limitations in this country about it. Secondly, a lot of us say that DDMRP does not require forecasting. Let me burst the myth here. If you look at your decoupling point, what is the way you define your inventory levels? That's a kind of a safety stock you may not understand. I was looking at dissecting the DDMRP and I found very interesting stuff. DDMRP safety level stocks are determined by simple moving averages with frequencies, not with time. You have a demand data with time and frequency. And this DDMRP with frequency makes sense because you can see the fluctuations in the recent period of the product, and hence you can predict it better, and you have this. But a time when you are predicting certain things which you do not have in your pipeline to the extent that it can funnel your pipeline to the last customer, the DDMRP fails. Your capacity and production plant fails. Your demand fulfillment fails. And hence, this is where things go wrong. And obviously, DDMRP for non-essential in India has become a static and stationary series. I'm not against DDMRP, but I'm just trying to say that if you don't understand the daily dynamics of demand planning and forecasting, this is going to be a very, very critical element of your planning, which is going to move. So how do you go about it? How do we really move? And before moving, let's look at some basic stuff. Without doubt, consumer behavior has changed across several dimensions: category consumptions, channel selections, shopper trip frequency, brand preferences, and media consumption. I think all these smaller words of luxuries and essentials now have given to a kind of a situation where people have postponed their buying of non-essential commodities and gone into what they think is essential and necessary in the short run. And hence, you have to move into that particular process of planning for the short run, which could be immediate midterm. These shifts combined with forecasts for virus containment and economic recovery are critical in understanding the long-term plan. We need to know the speed at which the virus is being contained or is spreading, as well as the kind of impact that is happening on the long-term economy and how this is going to play in the mid and the long run. Demand is no enigma. It doesn't happen because you can fulfill it in your pipeline. It's a great man's disease that we say that, oh, everything can be with DDMRP, but demand is an enigma. During a pandemic, one of the fundamental challenges in this planning is how do you perceive the immediate, mid, and the short run? And there are enough global agencies that are giving you the macro aggregate data of knowing how the economy will move. They're giving you predictions, and they're also projecting. There enough data on pandemic viruses. Map My India collects amazing amount of data, or NIC, that whatever is the app has enough data for us to start planning geography wise. But I would say Map My India is a critical database which shows which district, which zone, which part of the city is affected, and that could be used. And how long this is supposed to be a dynamic map of how these maps are going to change over a period of time also is available at Map My India, which helps us to visualize a long-term plan, not only for fulfilling demand and understanding what the demand is, and using this data, use this data in terms of analytics as big data. And big data is what? It collects data, it understands the characteristics of changes. This forecast can also be used as a characteristic changes, and you can forecast for what it is going to be. You can use the macroeconomic data and see which countries, which districts, which are going to behave differently, because it's going to be. And plus, you need to really know that what has been the major impact on your production facilities, and your bill of material will suffer a huge complexity and problems if you don't understand the risk and trace the risk to the last tier of your procurement or sourcing partner. Now, if this is not understood, then it is going to be really critical. How have been the companies looking at it? And I say the companies have been really looking at it in a very, very important way. And if you look at the chain, and if I just look at the retail supply chain, let me get back to a little bit of retail supply chain. I find that immediate action across supply chain also can be a way to understand the immediate action and the different scenarios that can be created. We don't need, forecast which is just single forecast. There could be different views point of how the pandemic is going to impact pandemic itself, deaths itself, as well as how it is going to impact the economy. And for that reason, if I look at a retail chain and look at suppliers, merchandisers, distributors, logistics, and fulfillment, I would say that people are looking at establishing daily meeting with strategic suppliers, reduce product variety. Obviously, the product varieties are reduced. You have to prioritize for the product variety, primarily because you have to merchandising has to be done on basis of this product variety. You need to see that the availability is there of the raw material. Your distribution channel needs to cater to these product varieties, and hence your logistics have to give preference to priorities of these demands, and your fulfillment have to be a part of this particular demand. You need to partner with different fulfillment agencies to see that these reasons. What has happened and what I said is that the huge shift in consumer demand, which will lead to revise buy plans and allocate staff, logistics plan, distribution plan, your fulfillment plan, and your demand plan. And your demand plan will be the one which will be the fulcrum of all this plan. It will be a base plan, but taking into account all these critical elements. But in a pandemic, when such things happen, we cannot assume that you can only prioritize those elements which are marketed in the market. We need to really move ahead. And how do we move ahead in the pandemic? And how do we see the pandemic? I would suggest that here is the case from forecasting, you can move to scenario planning, because the scenario planning is going to be a very critical element of future in such a disruptive when uncertainty has taken care, and when you have to build not deterministic plan, forecast based plan as it is, but yes, forecast may be useful here and there, and long term forecast will be helpful. But what about building a resilience policy as you move from different magnitude of this pandemic, different length of the pandemic, some different characteristics of the pandemic, and its entire shift in the consumer behavior and the economies and the purchasing power of people. Like, how do you really look at it? And that's very important. I think there could be numerous scenarios that you can build, but I would say 3 scenarios are very important. Worst case scenarios is one which is growing number of vacancy of essential transport companies, manpower is not available, businesses which have closed have gone out of business, do not have enough cash flows, small and medium businesses are, and it could be very pessimistic. I think thank God lockdown 2.0 has allowed, government has allowed to few businesses to come back. I see Nasik coming up in a big way, or smaller towns are trying to revert back. That's a good. So that scenario may not also true in India. The more optimistic one is that we are able to control and reduce the pandemic through testing, and life is back to normal by end of the next quarter, that's June. And in this transition period, what would be the demand? What would be the demand for logistics? What would be the demand for buying materials? How do you manage those materials? How do you diversify from the old buyers who cannot supply this material? New buyer, where are the supplies going to come, and how are you going to manage the factory? And you need to know. In fact, Kellogg's head of supply chain told me that they have taken a hotel near their factory and house all their workers there, because you cannot do away without workers, and you need to fulfill demand where demand for the bigger items, which are far better priorities have come about, are much higher. We need to produce them in factories which are closer to the catchment areas or states where the demands are high. And I think you need to build living spaces. If you don't have a hotel around your factories, you need to bring social distancing and all these things. So how do you go about if the second scenario is this thing? And the best case scenario is that most likely that the pandemic tapered down, we return to normal. Please believe me, if you return to normal, there could be 2 scenarios still. One, where a lot of people do not have enough manpower. It will take 3-4 months for manpower to transition back to the factories. The logistics players may not have drivers. You may not have cash flows, and all these are going to take planning for them right now becomes very important. So in fact, going forward, I would say that we need to look at the 5 things: identify suppliers in affected regions and estimate the risk, try to diversify, try to, bring visibility into your supplier base and hence help your production base. For each scenario, estimate demand and assess which product and assembly facilities will be affected by these suppliers, and how is this particular thing going to unfold as India moves into the next quarter, and what would have been the impact of this on the economy. A lot of people have felt doom for the economy, but I think we need to be critically looking at how things will happen, what will happen to non-essential demand. There will be a more pent-up demand and there will be more excess demand for essentials. How are they going to, taper off and, spike in the next period? We need to do a very strong scientific study of understanding these databases. I think connected planning, I do not have much time, but connected planning would be a better approach with inbuilt MI and analytics, which helps us to understand these data, put in economy data, putting catchment specific data, put geography specific data, and get this. Determine when and how long you should shut down. Now, determine how to ramp up capacity by focusing on sales and operation planning. Bring back the IBP into picture. Have a long-term view of how it looks, how pessimistic it looks, but how do you build those short-term view with integrated target planning, reviewing it daily, weekly, or maybe even bi-daily, and going and helping these things and understanding what would be the long-term investment into manpower to bring them back, to keep them happy. What are the changes that we need in the factory? How do we really diversify our supply base from multi-country to and understand the multi-tier challenges that is faced, and back up logistic capacity as soon as possible, because in India, logistics is fragmented. We treat logistic players very badly. We disrupt them. We don't have a human policy for the drivers. Neither do we have infrastructure to help drivers. We need to change. How do we need to be a part of the larger logistics ecosystem? I think planning, though I said decoding, forecasting, I'm saying forecasting without understanding all these elements in the pandemic would have been difficult, and decoding demand planning without understanding the interlinkages between the different layers of supply chain, integrating them, connecting them, and using data external and internal, which emerges in the short run, and understanding from the immediate market in the very, very immediate term will help plan better. I thought I'll bring this perspective, which has been haunting me, saying that are we really? And I would believe that DDMRP works very well when it's functional product, when the things are good. Pandemic can really derail DDMRP. We don't put things into account. Connected planning could be a better way to go, but connected planning with all these 5 basic things that we do will not be connected planning. If you don't have a very strong way of understanding data and how technology, with the help of IoT and blockchain, are helping to get into a digitalization, and a digitalization between both digital and physical are intertwined in a way that we can capture this data, planning would be a nightmare. And I think we need to plan this in a big way. Thank you very much. And now we can go for the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. We have some questions coming in, and I would request all of you to please type in your question and submit it to us, and we will take them up. The first question from Mandar is, what will be the demand trend for construction material like pipe fittings, cement, etc.? That's the first question, Dr. Singh.
As far as I see it, demand for almost all industrial category and construction category in the short run will fall. But as we come back and as India starts constructing its Sagarmalas and Bharatmalas and smart cities, and I think there's a need for India to start investing back into investments. One of the fundamental ways of looking at rebuilding the economy is through government investment in infrastructure, and I see that will take a strong lead in the future. And there are a lot of pent-up demand which will happen in terms of housing, in terms of construction. Some construction activities are already stopped, but now they will start from today or this week. And in the long run, as government pumps up into the infrastructure, I think the scenario is going to be much better for construction and infrastructure related activities. But definitely, yes, next 3 months are going to be defining moment.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Singh. I hope, Mandar, that answers your question. We have another question by Akash Sachdeva, and he's asking, if we try to build a mathematical model for demand prediction during the pandemic phase and after that, what are the variables should be considered? Variables for mathematical modeling.
Well, I think this is a very interesting question, and it haunts every data scientist today. You know, if you really look at the change that has happened in the last 7-8 years, it's not just because of the pandemic, but in the last 7-8 years, we are not realizing that any mathematical problem can definitely be defined by the characteristics of the data that you want, and the forecast of the data, external data that you have, is important. If you look at big data analytics, it's a funnel of mystery. All data is residing there. What it does is that it builds algorithm based on this particular data and brings in insight. Now, during pandemic, when uncertainties are large, when you do not have this data in the first phase, like I say 1 month, but in the last 1 month, you have enough data which can tell you the rate at which the economy has been opening up for essentials, the rate at which permissions have been coming, and there's a near total permission for transporters and disking, and demand has been changing. It can predict obviously the next 2 period demand, that this is the rate at which the demand will be, but you will have to add this to new data which emerges from different catchment areas which are red, green, zone, blocked, isolated. All those intelligence, human intelligence, which comes through SNOP and IBP has to come in to build a model. So no mathematical model will be complete in itself, but yes, some direction can be given, and some observations and assumptions can be changed by looking at what's happening around and bringing those quantitative data into picture to build your demand forecast. Mathematical modeling in its totality cannot really work. Mathematical modeling of the fuzzy logic kind of things can work. All mathematical modeling are time series and are deterministic. In such times, we need not deterministic model, but resilience model. And resilience model also can be predicted if you know the future of the demand, how it is unfolding. For instance, though I was critical of the hyperlocal because of DDMRP, I meant that hyperlocal gives you a great insight into how that locality is changing and how do you react to that locality, right? And suddenly you find that the locality changes because of the impact of coronavirus in a much different way. You should be ready for that kind of a demand, and you should be ready for that kind of a partnership with trucking and getting the supplies from your depots or from your factory. I think that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Yeah. The third question we have is, what are the top 3 things that businesses need to plan today?
Can you come again, Girish?
What are the top 3 things that businesses need to plan today? This is from Gopal Sahai. Top 3 things that businesses need to plan today.
The first thing businesses need to plan today is the factory and availability of labor, and your bill of material requirements are met. That's the first thing. The second thing that you need to plan is how are you going to register logistics capacity from the service provider. And third thing, which will define these two, is can you build a demand forecast? I'm not talking about a modular demand. Can you build a demand plan based on how the coronavirus will unfold, how the lockdown will unfold, and how the economy will impact the demand in the whole process? What are the best scenarios that you can plan for? Obviously, you have to plan for different scenarios because it's a time of pandemic. Build scenarios, the worst scenarios, the mid scenarios, the best, not so best scenarios, the best scenarios, and most optimistic scenarios. But as soon as these scenarios emerge, you can see where we are going and follow the route of that particular scenario. Hopefully, the pandemic does not return. So these are the three things that you need to really plan, Gopal. Thank you for the question.
There's Monica Parekh has asked a question. What will be the future of food industry in terms of demand planning?
Very dynamic. Very dynamic. And I think food industries which are in pandemic, they get really distorted, and there's a lot of panic buying, there's a lot of hoarding. One doesn't understand the plan, which is going to be very different. See, during the period of time of people wanting to reach, we resolve to reach people. Then we build up, we say, okay, if you have resolved to build people, what are the risk element that we can take into account? So we see that, okay, these are the hyper-local approaches to reaching. So we do this. We create a kind of a resilience within the understanding, which is brilliant. And then when we return to normal, everything is normal. But in the immediate phase of normal, when people have overpurchased, when demand has not been there, farmers has not really produced that particular commodity, he has shifted away from that commodity to something like sugarcane, so that he can de-risk his risk of not being able to sell vegetables or pulses or cereals. Now this will again come back. I think the pandemic will have how long will it be is a matter of concern, but will it really derail the planning process? No, it can have certain element of good things, which becomes a part of the corporate social responsibility, where you pay fair prices to the farmer, you trace and see that there's a lot of originality in the product. There's not much of traces of pesticides in it. All those things will happen. A lot of changes will happen in the future as we go about. Social distancing in the farms also will become reality. But planning demand would be based on two things. How strongly can we vertically integrate with the farmer in India? That would be one element of change, which is already happening. And second thing is that how the whole chain of fulfillment and buying and sourcing is well equipped with cold storage, temperature based transport, and service provider. Even in terms of international, how well can a temperature control vehicle can straightway move into the belly of a airport, or into a sea craft? All these are going to be new changes that are going to happen. But I think the demand forecast for the food is going to remain very, very, very similar, with spikes normalizing in next 7, 8, 9. If you ask me, I think 6 months it will normalize and things will be back.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I hope that answers question. We have a question from Aditya Varshane. His question is: you said connected planning is one of the trends of the future, and using analytics it can be achieved. But is it possible that companies will collaborate for data sharing? Dr. Singh?
Yeah, I think I agree with you that companies in India don't even collaborate with each other in the whole process of planning. I think Greece and I have done so many work for companies, and the recent experience has been that wherever you go, there is a firefighting. So there is a demand from the sale that has to be fulfilled. Whole connected planning, even if you have a solution, goes for a toss. By connected planning, I meant that it seemed like DDMRP. Why I said it was better is that because it does not claim that it doesn't have to look at data. It can use analytics. So how do you connect all your element of logistics, production, procurement, distribution, fulfillment, and sales and marketing and after sales service into a process whereby you see everything visibly, what lies where, and you know the constraint, and you can say that we cannot service this, or we can only service this. You put the constraint, you know the lead time, and then you don't talk about fulfilling everything, but you can say that, oh, this is where we cannot really give you. You look at the cost to serve through different nodes and different factories and are able to say this. You look at data which emerges from your own data internal, so that all your marketing and logistics policies which have a very adverse impact on fluctuations and variability can be taken care of. Between connected planning between companies is going to be very, very difficult. Indian companies work within their sphere of influence, but I have seen vertical coordination in inventory management, a horizontal inventory manager emerging as a tools everywhere, and maybe in future this may be a trend. Yeah, Girish.
Yeah, Dr. Singh, your camera seems to be off. Can you please check that also? In the meanwhile, there is a question on theory of constraint. Kuldeepak Singh has the comment that TOC also can measure approach to avoid risk in volatile situation like this. Would like to know your views on this.
Obviously, yes. Theory of constraint to me is nothing more than a linear programming problem which optimizes whatever is available. It requires a very strong sense of understanding of environment. It also requires agility in thinking, not only agility in enterprise, but agility in thinking, knowing what is happening in the future rather than what is coming from the market. I think theory of constraint is another disguised name of DDMRP, and all my view holds for the DDMRP also holds for theory of constraint, Kuldeepak. And what I think is that if you don't understand the pandemic, you don't understand the characteristics in terms of scale, speed, and characteristics, and you don't keep incorporating them into the model, and you think that whatever with the number you put in into the constraints will see to it that from where and how to fulfill with the minimum cost to serve, I think is a very simplistic truth. And it's very different. Secondly, if you don't incorporate the 1.5 years or 18-month horizon of understanding how the world economy is going to behave, how the local economy is going to behave, and how the international economy is going to. I'll give you an example. I think you must be from Godrej, and I know very clearly of one particular experiment that happened in this country called as Haryali Kisan Bazaar from DCM Siram Group, and they were doing very well. They were adopting theory of constraints in managing rural markets. I was wondering, nobody has a control and pulse of this rural market beyond the distributors. But here is the company which is claiming this. One fine day in October 2016, I heard that the company is closed after 10 years of a very beautiful opera. I, as a professor, used to teach this as one of the brilliant cases on supply chain management in rural India. We realized that 3 consecutive drops that they never built into their DDMRP really led to a failure of this thing, because if there is no demand from the end consumer and you don't take cognizant of that, and you're looking at what is being demanded from the retail store and going, and you don't have a long-term view of what is happening, you end up with amazing inventory. An inventory where your variability is so high that your standard deviation in mean looks same, and your what you call it, a decoupling point will have a inventory, or maybe there it will have the normal inventory, but the beyond the district level, the inventory will be amazingly high, and you will be surprised what's wrong with it. So I think there is a need to be more reactive. It is MRP, lean, plus a kind of insight from the economy, insight from the market important. However way you define forecast or not forecast, these insights are very important. One thing that is common between pandemic and no pandemic is information. Maybe you can do away with forecasting, as you say, very vehemently. But what about information? What kind of information? And forecast gives you information. If your product is a functional product which behaves every day, and you see a surge today, use the last year data to see what is the level of surge which is because of the pandemic and correct it.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Singh. The next question is from Ravi Hegde. How can technology shift the demand and planning post COVID-19? The use of technology post COVID-19.
See, the technology has the potential to save this. I answer this because, see, if you can connect everything, you can have a blockchain which acts as a laser and which people cannot really play with the data, and data security is taken care of. If you have analytics which can capture data from weather, from prices, from economy, from this thing, and you have control towers or vertical towers which connects each and every nodes of your supply business chain, then you can bring in visibility. And I think that limits us to a kind of a digital twin. And I would say that that brings visibility across. A Harvard Business School article saying the depth of supply chain says that everything will be visible. Why do you need a supply chain? Supply chain will be visible. But I think this pandemic answers that. The physical twin and not so capturable data by the digital spin or twin can be a source of understanding. As I said, reserve logistics, there's going to be a constraint, and constraint is going. Build partnership, build collaboration, diversify your supplier base, build partnership with not tier 1 supplier, but tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. Maybe you provide support to them in order to survive this onslaught of pandemic. So this is what digital, and I think digital will help you to trace even the last tier 4 suppliers capability to service you. You can plan, move away from him and move to another supplier, and de-risk yourself or diversify this thing, which will be in need of the hour.
There is a question from Hitesh Katre. What is the percentage of accuracy of scenario-based planning if the business is seasonal in nature?
Why do you need a scenario? No, I'll answer to this. Why do you need scenario when business is seasonal? Then you need the simple moving averages, either with time or with frequency. It's frequency if there are a lot of changes in the recent past. And this is where DDMRP works the best. Yeah, Girish.
The next one is from Shiva Prasad. Do you think this is an opportunity for India to be a global manufacturing hub?
I wish, and I do believe that India would become a manufacturer. You see, the large number of investment in the high technology sector has already come into India. Indian Pink Press talks more about the saffron rather than the economy, and they see the economy in terms of numbers rather than how this economic capability is being built. I think India needs to do a lot, provide good quality infrastructure. That's why I said India will definitely invest into infrastructure, ease business conditions in comparison with our competitor where suppliers are based for the world market to come in. And India being a democracy and India being a more open economy and society, I think, and India also has the manpower. It's one of the destinations for demand. It has an internal market. All things goes in favor of India. But I think Indian government needs to take this opportunity. Indian businesses also need to take this rather than sourcing from everything from China. They should start building something here. They should backward integrate for some time, and the cost of transportation should be the basic differentiation point that benefit should go to the Indian players. I think India has a huge potential for being in one of the hubs. I think the world businesses will not invest in one or two countries. They are going to diversify. There is going to be localization and regionalization of sourcing hubs as it's being realized now. And there has to be a multiple diversification that takes place. But even if we get 1/3 of what can come to India, India would be a power to reckon with.
There's a question from Pradeep Mishra. how do we invest more collaborative and agile planning and fulfillment capabilities? He wants to know. Yeah.
Yeah, Girish, go ahead.
I think the question is a little bit incomplete. How do we invest more in collaborative and agile planning and fulfillment capabilities?
All right. I think I've seen a lot of companies investing into this APOs. I won't name any APOs. And they get quite a good data, but they don't know how to analyze the data. And hence they mess up with their planning by firefighting and servicing a demand in North India from a factory in West India and a factory in South India. I think the first ever investment that you make into anything is that let the APO understand your business and you understand the APO. I asked a set of 30 demand planners in HUL, what goes in your APO? Nobody knew this. And look at this, we are talking about planning, forecasting, mathematical logic, and things like that. It is very important for us to know what goes into APO. Second thing is that no solution can be the solution to the problems of planning. Solution is an enabler. You need to build your respective capability in terms of building teams, whether it is IBP or it is advanced SNOP, or you call it as, whatever is collaborative team, you can call different names. You need to come together, review your portfolios. In this case, it would be prioritizing your portfolio for the pandemic period. Then review your demand, saying the whole demand has fallen down for all commodities. It is only for essential. Even then, those who are orange zones or red zones, we cannot reach them properly. For them, there's a different fulfillment model. So how do you fulfill that? And then you look at supply review, say, oh, those most of the bill of materials are not available. We cannot go to run the factory. The manpower is not there. Can we into communication, which is frank, governed by and headed by the leadership and the CEO of the organization? And this is the transition period that we need to do. Pradeep, I think if we do this, planning can become a reality, because planning is reacting to what is seen, not reacting to a number. Planning is reacting to what is seen. Gather those information and build a number out of it, or build multiple numbers out of it. If I say a number, the DMRP guys will catch me, because they are multi-client inventory modeling. So let's say that build all numbers that the market requires based on the market data, market understanding, market characteristics.
Yeah, one final question by Ajay Sharma: which would be more beneficial to predict future demand, expert advice in that particular field or different mathematical model based on historical data?
The expert advice in that particular field will be biased with his own opinion. So there could be expert bias, and what is the second one?
Mathematical models based on historic data.
If your data shows a pattern, obviously mathematical model will help. If it shows a trend or it shows a seasonality or shows a mix of the two, it will help. The rest of things, I think we need to really look at this and move into more of big data analysis. If you have enough data points, build scenarios of what is going to come. If it is a normal scenario when everything is going good, I think you can build one scenario, or best and not so best, taking into account, and start doing this. I think mathematical modeling based supply chain has their own limitations. If I was in your place, I would do like this. I would take the expert opinion only in the sense of how the business, that market is going, what is going to be the market share, what is going to be the size of the market. I would take the data to understand how my product has been actually behaving. I will take the market intelligence from the sales force, who are not biased. They are not based on your sales force, are responsible for forecast, will bring the very, very intricate element of the last miles as to changes, and also of the larger databases, for instance, market research report that would be there. And I will build a very combined forecast of it. Let my IBP team or let my SNOP team decide what the baseline forecast is because of the forecast and because of the sales force, and how do we change according to the scenario which are being forecasted. So I think it is it can be answered depending upon your business environment, your data ability. But for a seasonal product, you know, I've seen some product even for Asian Paints. I've seen it for Mahindra tractors. You find that that September, October, November we can predict the demand. It's so easy to predict with the past data. Why have a mathematical modeling? Just have a moving average. Just have a winter model. You don't need anything else. Or when the crop is bad, add plus how the economy has actually suffered, how the farmers have suffered, and build that particular purchasing power data. It is, it's a interpreter's paradise. The demand planner cannot be bogged down with one technique or another. He has to get the best available information which can be decoded into the best possible range of demand, not one demand, but the range of demand.
Dr. Singh, we are currently running at more than an hour of your session. Would you like to take a couple more questions, or
I think we can answer those questions offline also now. If there is a
yes,
problem with the GoToWebinar, we can answer them offline too.
Yes, because I think we will run out of time for that.
It may just go
to all
anything.
who have asked your questions, we have your email ID with us, and we will reach out to you with answers individually, because the GoToWebinar has a timing option which we might run out of. I thank everyone for having logged in today and attended this webinar on decoding demand planning and forecasting in a post-COVID world. I thank Dr. Rakesh Singh for having brilliantly exposed the challenges that the demand planning forecasting professional faces, and also has offered some interesting solutions and thought processes by which we can approach the whole process. I wouldn't call them solutions, I would rather say an approach or a thought process which you need to think about, which you need to internalize, and which you need to implement basis your own experience and basis your own situation. We hope this webinar was of use to you. You will find a transcript of this at our website very shortly. Again, I would request you all to have a look at scmpro.knowledge.in, where we will have all our webinars, all our thought leadership articles, all our ISCM papers listed. We also would request you to keep visiting our site to know more about the upcoming webinars which we are being offering. We thank you all for the attendance. We also thank Team ISCM for having put up this fantastic show. Behind the scenes, all of you, Jaisal, Sanjay Pal, Pallavi, and Yvonne, great job. Thank you very much. I hope to see you very quickly at the next ISCM webinar. And once again, to all those people who have asked your questions, we have your questions. We will come back to you with a direct reply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Girish.